and join me in a prayer for sacred engagement with our tradition. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Let all the words that we offer today be words of Torah and words in the spirit of Torah. Join me at the beginning of our official learning today with a moment of silence in acknowledgement of the people who have been killed in the current conflict, and in acknowledgement of the many people who are anxiously following their cell phone alerts to the next rocket strike, who are huddling with their loved ones and their neighbors in concrete bunkers, and whose lives are not right now in their own hands. So take a few moments with me just for silence, and then we'll proceed. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. May the one whose peace extends into the highest reaches of the universe help us to be instruments of divine peace among the Jewish people and the human family. Amen. So there's no comfortable way to go from gut-wrenching, violent conflict to the well springs of wisdom that we find in Pirkei Avot. Nevertheless, that is what we do. And it helps us become not just better people, not just better Jewish people, but also a better Kihila Kedosha, a stronger, more connected, sacred community. So I actually am grateful for this time to study with you. It's not, in my view, a distraction from the world news, but rather a holy pursuit and a way of reinforcing what for Jewish people matters most, even at times like this. So that's my ham-fisted segue, and onward we proceed. We are going to complete, halavai, God willing, Pirkei Avot chapter 2 today. Some of the themes that we have already been exploring, namely what the first teaching in this chapter identifies as derech yeshara, the right path that a person should choose in life, which is both an invitation to consider one's pursuit of Jewish living, of Torah and mitzvot, and also of worldly occupation, as well as the moral and spiritual qualities that a person should cultivate. All of these together come under quite some serious consideration in the chapter that we have been exploring up until this point. So we've looked at the first 12 teachings. We're going to pick up at teaching number 13. I'll bring the text on the screen momentarily. That's the theme. The order, or the format by which this chapter has been organized, is more or less chronological. It's mostly been a kind of walk down rabbinic memory lane, starting with some of the teachings of the last of the great rabbis of the early generations of the rabbinic yeshiva, first in Yavne, as established by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and then proceeding through 5 generations of his disciples. So, of course, like a family tree, it proliferates in terms of the numbers of teachers, and each teacher raises up teachers of his own, so that you conclude with the final leader of the rabbinic community, Rabbi Judah Hanasi, or Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the prince, Judah the statesman, Judah the intercessor with the Roman government, Judah the great exponent of rabbinic teaching, who is credited with compiling the final edition of the Mishna, the book that we're studying. So a really important figure in Jewish life and Jewish textual history. Judah Hanasi then is given the first place in the chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot, but quickly we go backward in time, all the way back to Hillel. And then from Hillel, and we learn some of Hillel's core teachings. From Hillel, we learn about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, the last and perhaps even least of Hillel's disciples. And then we learn that Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples of his own, starting with a guy named Eliezer, or Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, and the 5th of them being Elazar ben Arach. And in between, there's rabbis named Joshua, Yehoshua, Yossi, not Jose, and Shimon. So the 5 of them are Eliezer, Yehoshua, Yossi, Shimon, and Elazar ben Arach. And these 5 each are given a little bit of place to share their teachings. And most of their teachings are threefold maxims. So that's just a recap of everything we've covered in this chapter thus far. Today we complete the chapter, and I think where we left off was in the middle of the teachings of the disciples of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. So we're going back to the end of the first generation of the Rabbinic Academy after the destruction of the temple. So we're talking about the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. With all of that as an unnecessarily elongated setup, allow me now to share the words on the screen, which are here attributed to Rabbi Shimon. So the 3rd of the 5 disciples of Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Rabbi Shimon said, and you can see the text is on the screen here. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Omer, you now know, is to say. Hevei zahir b'kriyat shama uva tefila. Not hard, because most of these words you translate from Hebrew to Hebrew. Be careful with the reading of the Shema, b'kriyat shema. Kriya is reading. B'kriyat shema uva tefila. And with the, here they just say, and the prayer. But it might even be easier not to translate it. Be careful, or maybe the word is meticulous. I like the word meticulous better. Be meticulous with the reading of the Shema and the tefillah. The tefillah is the anthologized prayer that on a weekday is also known as the Shemona Esrei, the 18 benedictions. On Shabbat, it's not actually 18, it's just 7. We talked about this, I believe, just last week, or 2 weeks ago, that weekday, the theme of the Amidah is first gratitude and then petition. And on Shabbat, the theme of the 7 benedictions that make up the largest aggregate prayer in the liturgy is gratitude across the board. Because on Shabbat, we don't treat God like a cosmic vending machine. On Shabbat, we just say, thank you for all the blessings. There are indeed a couple of prayers that nominally are petitionary, even on Shabbat. They are the prayers asking God to bestow upon us the compassion that God bestowed upon our ancestors for the sake of their merit. That's Avot, or we say in Reformed tradition, Avot v'imachot, the first one. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu ve'imotenu. Right? So thank you, God of our ancestors. You did all these nice things for Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. We don't deserve such compassion, but because they did deserve it, please be nice to us as well. That's the theme of the first one. Most of the rest of the prayers are simply praise, acknowledgement, and gratitude on Shabbat. But the last prayer is a petition that the rabbi said is appropriate even on Shabbat, and especially today, I would add, which is Birkat Shalom, the prayer or blessing for shalom or peace. That even on Shabbat, or maybe especially on Shabbat, it's always appropriate to beseech the divine to be an instrument of shalom in our lives and in the world. And that, of course, is retained. And that's why the Amidah concludes with the words, Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. So that's the tefillah. Be careful with your reading of the Shema and the tefillah, or be meticulous. And then it goes on from there. Ucheshe'ata mitpalel. And when you're praying, the word mitpalel from tefillah, or vice versa, when you are mitpaleling, when you are praying, al ta'as tefillatcha keva. We've heard this actually before. Do not make your tefillah into a keva. Keva is one of the 2 Hebrew words that's kind of assonant, sounds similar because they both begin with a K sound, though they're spelled with 2 different Hebrew letters. This one is spelled with a kuf, keva, which means fixed. Here they translate it quite nicely in an idiomatic way. Do not make your prayer something automatic. Literally, the word keva means fixed. And in fact, in verb form, keva is a noun. It's a fixed thing. That which is fixed is keva. And that can be liturgical or non-liturgical, right? So your prayer, the language on the page, the words printed in the siddur, that is what is keva about your prayer. It's always the same. It comes in the same place, in the same order, and is davened at the same time of day or on the holiday or what have you. That's the keva. It doesn't have to apply to prayer language, by the way. It's a word that you can use for almost anything. If your morning habit is getting up and doing yoga, that's your keva. If your evening ritual is brushing your teeth and watching, CNN for half an hour, that's keva for you. Anything that is fixed or even habitual. The negative valence of keva, though, is something that is rote, R-O-T-E. So I don't like the word automatic as much as I would prefer rote. I think rote conveys so much about what keva means, in that rote isn't necessarily bad if you're trying to inculcate a regular discipline, right? So you want a keva to your good habits, but you don't want them to be on autopilot. And that's where the other dimension of a prayer life comes into play, and that is the similar sounding word kavanah. It's got the K sound and the V sound in it, kavanah, but it's spelled with a kaf instead of a kuf. It's spelled with the Hebrew letter kaf or chaf. Kavanah, kaf, vet, nun, hey. Kavanah means intention, feeling, desire, volition, something that's deliberate about your prayer, and that's you're thinking about the words. You're not just on such muscle memory or rote recitation that it's a meaningless exercise. So that's the yin and the yang of Jewish prayer life. Keva, the fixed, kavanah, that which comes from a place of feeling or intention. So here the text says, Pirkei Avot teaches, or Shimon specifically, Rabbi Shimon teaches, Al ta'as tfilat hakeva, don't make your tefillah a keva, ela, but rather, rachamim v'tachanunim lifnei hamakom baruch hu, but rather they should be literally a plea for mercy and beseeching before the omnipresent blessed one. How do they translate here? But a plea for compassion before God. But the language is so much better than that, frankly, in Hebrew. But rather, ela means rather. Rachamim, like Rachmanis, you may know from Yiddish, rachamim is compassion. The tachanunim means plea, P-L-E-A, or lament, or beseeching. Here they just say a plea for compassion. It's actually two words, rachamim v'tachanunim. And a tachanun is a specific kind of prayer. It's a prayer beseeching God to be compassionate with us despite all of our flaws and foibles. Lifnei, literally lifnei means before, but in the presence of. Hamakom, which literally means the place. Makom is a place, but it's one of the many, many ways in which the rabbis refer to and understand God. Before the makom, the omnipresent one, the one whose place is every place, as it were. Before the place, Baruch Hu, of blessing, or blessed is he, or blessed be God. Shen ne'emar, from Omer, by the way, the same root that says Rabbi Shimon Omer. Shen ne'emar is the passive form, as it is said. And now we're going to get a quote from the minor prophet Yoel. So this takes us all the way back to Tanakh Bible. Ki chanun v'rachumhu, erech apayim v'rav chesed, v'nicham al hara'ah. If some of these words sound familiar, they are familiar from the liturgical formula that is recited before the open ark when we take the Torah out on festivals and the high holidays. We stand before the open ark and we say the words that God says to Moses on Mount Sinai when revealing the law. Moses says, hey, let me know your face, or let me see your face. And God says, I can't show you my face, but you can stand here on the mountain in the cleft in this rock here, and I will let my back pass before you. And more importantly, you will experience my spiritual qualities. This is all God speaking to Moses. And that's when God declares, Adonai, Adonai, the Lord, El Rachum v'Chanun, a God compassionate and gracious, erech apayim v'rav chesed ve'emet, endlessly patient, loving, and true. And then it goes on from there, bestowing kindness on the 1000th generation, but yada, yada, yada. There's a whole formula, and it becomes a liturgical, a bullet, not a bullet point, a pull-out quote. And it becomes the thing that Jewish people say on the festivals and the high holidays when we take the Torah out. We remind the congregation that the God before whom we stand is one who is basically really, really compassionate and is going to forgive your sins, even if you're, like all human beings are, a bit of a mess, even if you make mistakes. We say, God, God, you are so compassionate and gracious, as a way of inviting God to be reminded of God's best qualities. Okay, so here, this is the proof text for why your prayers should be a plea beseeching God for mercy and compassion, as opposed to a rote recitation of Hebrew words in a particular order in a prayer book, right? So as I often remind people when I'm leading a service, particularly a bar mitzvah service, where, to be perfectly honest, many people are not really there to pray. I shouldn't say that. That's not the intention that they're bringing to that hour and a half that we're going to be spending in the sanctuary together, right? They want to see their kid come up and read Torah. They forgot that they're going to be asked to actually pray along and feel something and be a participant, not a passive observer. I always say to them, please remember that prayer is not the words on the page. Prayer is something that happens here. So that's really what this text is saying. Don't make your prayer about a rote recitation of what's on the page, but rather make your prayer something beseeching God for compassion and mercy, as it is written, for God is full of grace and compassion. God is endlessly patient. V'rav chesed means filled with loving kindness. V'nicham al hara'ah, and God will renounce punishment. God will take away or cause all the bad stuff to go away. And the final phrase here, V'al tihi rasha bifnei atzmacha. This feels like a complete non sequitur. And be not wicked in your own esteem. Literally, do not be bad bifnei atzmacha, before yourself. So we're going to spend more time on that last phrase, but some of what we've looked at in the first 2/3 of this threefold maxim, which is again attributed to Rabbi Shimon, we have 3 major points. The first 2 points are all about what prayer should and should not be for you. And then the third point is, don't be ra, bad, bifnei atzmecha. Literally, in facing yourself, don't be bad. We'll talk about what that means, because it's one of those mysterious statements that, again, feels to me like a non sequitur. But some of the fun of this class, for me especially, has been hearing how you, fellow learners, are discovering invisible lines of connection that may make a text that feels obscure at first feel less obscure upon deeper consideration. So, long way through that first text, because there's a lot going on. I now will open up the floor for your questions, comments, and thoughts, either with digital hands raised or just unmuting yourself and chiming in. A private message, by the way, in the chat came my way, which correctly acknowledges that there is a unique section of the daily liturgy, usually in the morning prayers, the Shacharit service, called Tachanun, which is the word I translated as beseeching, a prayer beseeching God for compassion. That actually is not just a descriptor for a certain kind of feeling of a prayer. It's an actual rubric of prayer in the morning service. And certainly the rabbis who wrote this were aware of that there are tachanunim. Most Reform Jews, it was one of the things that the early German reformers quickly cut out. It's like, why do we need all this self-flagellating stuff? This is so depressing. It's adding length to the service. We want to get through this. We've got jobs to get to. I'm being a little bit flippant here, but that's the idea, that most Reform Jews, even those who have a very regular prayer practice, may not be familiar with the custom of tachanun, of the regular insertion into the morning service of prayers beseeching God for compassion. Sometimes there's even doing this, beating yourself on the chest during tachanun. Sometimes they're accompanied by fasting. Most Reform Jews are not familiar with that custom. And if you pray only on Shabbat and holidays, you definitely won't be familiar with tachanun, because you don't tachanun on Shabbat and holidays, right? Because Shabbat and holidays are gratitude and joy. They're not about self-flagellation and beseeching God, oh, I'm not worthy, but please be kind to me. All right, my dad, you have a digital hand up. You can speak, please.
Just to take a stab at the last phrase there, it seems to be an admonition to be humble in your prayers.
Yeah, okay, so one possible read on this is connecting the theme to your prayer life, is be humble, right? So this is about how you see yourself as the supplicant. So perhaps it is about humility. Another conjecture here, perhaps it is that in all of this, remember the last thing that we've just said is that you have to approach God beseeching God for mercy. And I link that in the Jewish experience to, for lack of a better way of putting it, self-flagellation. And there is, I think, perhaps in this last comment, a recognition that there's an upper limit to self-flagellation, past which point it becomes an exercise in self-flagellation becomes self-abuse, which actually negates self-worth. And that's actually no way to stand before God in prayer. We don't come before God saying, I'm not worthy because I'm nothing. We simply say, hey, I'm a human being. I'm worth something. I'm just not perfect. So I think that there's a Maimonidean middle road to be taken here, or an Aristotelian middle road that Maimonides adapted as his own golden mean way of looking at the world. So yeah, come before God with humility, not with total self-abnegation. Sorry for all the 50-cent words today, but you know how much I like those. And if you need me to clarify my meaning, I'm happy to. Other thoughts on anything that we've just encountered from Rabbi Shimon? Alan, join in, please.
The conversation about praying by rote, I think it's a two-edged sword. If you go to a baseball game, you stand for the national anthem. And do you pay attention to the words and the meaning of the actual poem, song? Or do you take it to another level and say, you know what, America is a great place. We're here to have a good time. We're enjoying peace. And that is the overlying umbrella to the detail of saying something in rote. So sometimes you say it, but your mind takes you someplace to a better place.
Yeah, I, as a person who tries to take seriously the art and discipline of Jewish prayer, I appreciate both the meaning of what you've just shared and also the analogy by which you have shared it to the national anthem. That, you know, at the end of the day, you kind of just have to know the words and know the ritual. And you're not expected, I think, to be dwelling on the inner meaning of every single word or phrase. And that sometimes the freedom to contemplate or to enter a deeper state of awareness about the meaning of your prayers is actually made possible by having such familiarity with the words that you're not, you know, worried about, am I pronouncing this right? Particularly when it's in a foreign language. And let's not forget that the rabbis are dealing with people for whom Hebrew was not their first language. Maybe even for themselves, Hebrew was not their vernacular at this point. Aramaic was. And although they are cognate languages, they are quite significantly and substantially different. So I think there's a recognition here that, look, we know that asking Jewish people to develop a meaningful prayer life is already a reach, right? This is not Judaism 101. Developing a meaningful prayer life is actually fairly advanced, which is why the rituals around bar and bat mitzvah are indeed centered around training a young person to be a competent prayer leader, because it's a sign that you've attained a certain level of mastery of the basics of Jewish life, at least in a ritual or liturgical sense. So having said that, the freedom to explore, to contemplate, to ruminate, to let your mind go deep is only made possible once you have the basic capacity to daven. And Alan, I hope you can also relate to this, and not to pat yourself on the back too much, but as a seasoned davener yourself, you probably didn't even need the analogy of the Star Spangled Banner at a ball game, because you actually are exemplary in this direction. You have a prayer life. You can, I'm sure you don't need to be holding your siddur to get the words out. But your familiarity with the prayer, I would hope, unlocks the possibility that on any given day, your thoughts may go deeper into the prayer, precisely because you're not breaking your teeth on just the basics of recitation.
That's exactly right. But I think in our shul, the people who are regular temple goers can leave the burden of the word-to-word translation and take the overriding theme of the prayer and say, this is what I'm focusing on, and not get bogged down by the minutia of the word.
Great. I so appreciate that spiritual permission that you've just given our fellow congregants. It's a blessing. It completely resonates with me. As a fun aside, by the way, and I think that I'm tickled by this, but almost on an impulse, I signed up to go back to Ulpan earlier this week. I found an online Hebrew intensive class. So I've committed myself to the next 10 weeks, starting in late June, actually. So to a 10-week, actually, I committed myself to 20 weeks, twice a week, 90 minutes each time of online intensive Hebrew study, mostly conversational. In other words, what I don't need to improve is my facility with, I can always improve, but what I'm not focused on right now is improving my facility with rabbinic, classical, or Mishnaic, or Torah Hebrew. But I realized I still choke up in conversation. I can get by in Israel. I can order a loaf of bread. I can direct people, not to get lost on their way to the bathroom in a restaurant. But I don't feel fluid with Hebrew conversational speech patterns, with modern idioms, with slang, because I'm just not doing it. And this is a course that's specifically geared at everyday Hebrew, including lots of slang and things like that. So I'll be in a class on Zoom every Tuesday and Thursday at 5:30 for 90 minutes a time, with 10 other students and a teacher who, God bless him or her, is going to be teaching at 12:30 a.m. Israel time, live. And I'll let you know how it goes, but I'm really looking forward. My goal is that by the next time I go to Israel, I'm really able to have much more fluent conversations. So this is a relevant comment, I think, because with fluidity with a foreign language, and prayer is a foreign language, even if you're davening in English, right? Because it's not the way people talk. It's not the way I talk. Well, maybe it's the way I talk. The language of the Hebrew prayer book, even in translation, is for most of us foreign. And when you develop fluidity with the keva, with the what is written down, it gives you a sense of self-confidence, and it gives you a new tool for your spiritual life. So I'm planning to do that with my spoken Hebrew as well. I'll let you know how it goes. I'm actually really excited. I start the last week of June. First semester ends just before the high holidays, and then second semester starts right after Sukkot. So I'll keep you posted. Plus, there are 4 times a week optional drop-in sessions where you can just log on and schmooze in Hebrew. It's really fun. I took my assessment. They placed me in the indigo level class. I don't know what that means. They just said, oh, you're indigo. I'm like, well, is that good? They said, yeah, it's level 7 out of 8. I said, that sounds scary. I don't think I'm ready for that. They say, no, your Hebrew's really good. It's just that there are a lot of holes. And they said exactly what I felt when I took the assessment a few days ago. They said, your problem, it's I felt very seen. They said, your problem is when you want to say something in Hebrew, you're first thinking of it in English, and then you're translating it. I said, that's exactly my problem. And that's why I can't keep up in a conversation. I can understand everything that somebody's saying to me, but when I want to respond, I'm first thinking it in English, and then I'm saying it in Hebrew. And I'm a grammarian. So of course, if I'm off on the grammar, I beat myself up. I'm the person that Shimon is talking to at the end of this text. Do not be wicked in your own eyes. Like, I'm such a perfectionist about language that I have a very hard time with casual conversation in Hebrew, where the grammar is secondary or tertiary. So they say to me, yeah, you're just thinking too much. We want to get you to think in Hebrew. I said, great, sign me up. Okay,
Now
Audrey.
you have to dream in Hebrew.
What's that?
Then when you dream in Hebrew, you really come.
Indeed. The last time I was in Ulpan, of course, was my first year of rabbinical school in 1995, 1996. So, 25 years ago. And right around this time, actually, toward the very end of my year in Israel, as part of my HUC training, I had dreams in Hebrew. And I knew that, and I remember them very clearly. And it was a significant milestone in my Hebrew development, because I'm like, aha, I really am dreaming in Hebrew, because I was using it all the time. But it's been 25 years. That's a long time. And the only way in which I've kept the language fresh for me is here, right? In these classes. This is why I love Hebrew. I know you know that. But my problem is when I go to Israel, I speak Mishnaic Hebrew when I'm trying to order a loaf of bread. So people look at me. This has actually happened. That funny story. I walk into a grocery store and I forget the word for, can I get change for a 20? Right? It's the kinds of things that you just need to say. And so I said something like that would sound in English kind of like, hast thou any minted coinage for this bill? Like, I don't have the right words. I had a Hebrew Mishnaic word that hasn't been used. It would be like asking for, 6 pence at a grocery store. I asked for a form of currency that hasn't existed in Israel in 2,000 years, because it was the only word I remembered for coins. Okay. And he's like, oh, you mean you want change? Okay. Audrey, will you chime in, please? Uh-oh, your computer is...
discussion
Here
or
you go.
a description of prayer, it seems to me, oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Keep going.
It seems to me the self-flagellation, well, it rang true in terms of Yom Kippur, but normally it seems to me that we praise God, but it is about beseeching or asking for good things like compassion or mercy or maybe good health, which, I mean, it seemed to me that is the essence of prayer, that combined with praise of God.
Yeah, the two P words associated with prayer in the Jewish norms are petition and praise.
Right.
They go hand in hand. And a lot of it is, I'm going to butter you up first and then ask. So usually the order is praise, petition, praise. It's like, God, you're so great. You've done all these great things. Historically, today, you made the sun rise. You were kind to our ancestors. You are really powerful. You can cause the grass to grow. By the way, my crops are looking bad. Can you help me out? You're so wonderful. You're so great. Okay, that's so it's generally a PPP sandwich. Praise, petition, praise.
Okay.
Absolutely. Trish Shalafu.
I just wanted to observe, kind of following up on what Alan was saying about prayer, was that it's interesting that our newest prayer book put in a supposedly accurate translation of the prayer in addition to an interpretive reading. Because for those of us who don't know Hebrew and learn the prayers rote, and kind of had an idea what they were about, it was useful to see what the original intention of the prayer was,
Right.
and then create your own not translation, your own interpretation, so you can agree with the interpretation that's in the prayer book, or say, I have a better understanding now of what this prayer originally was for. What does it mean to me in my present life? So
I think that's right.
it's useful to have all those pieces of information. So
I like your observation here. And I think that if you want to get inside of the minds of the editors of Mishkan Tefillah and Mishkan HaNefesh, the new regular and high holiday prayer books that the movement has published over the last 15 years, you can detect that they are aware of a bit of a paradox or a bit of a split in the Jewish community. That for some people, being more aware of the literal meaning of the prayers draws them closer to the art and the act of Jewish prayer. But for some people, being closer to the literal meaning of the prayers can actually be distancing, because the literal meaning of the prayers bespeaks their time and place in a way that may not resonate with the spirituality and theology of 21st century American Jews, right? So the things that the rabbis cared about, the way they related to God, the even just with the so predominantly masculine imagery associated with the divine, the more literal your translation of the prayer, the more you may find yourself out of step with its sensibilities. On the other hand, if you're like me, the more you know what you're saying, the more empowered you feel as a davener. So I think that there's this kind of, dialectic that's going on here in two possible different directions, which is why the framers of the new prayer books, the High Holiday Machzor and the regular Siddur, Mishkan HaNefesh and Mishkan Tefillah, said, let's give them both. On one side of the page, we'll have the Hebrew and a faithful translation. And on the facing page, we'll have interpretive readings that thematize or take the theme of the prayer, but don't convey it as literally. And maybe that will be your open door to have a deeper, more meaningful spiritual connection to the prayer, so that you recognize that the prayer is just a springboard for deeper contemplation, right? And there too is the Keva Kavanah balancing act. Trish, I really appreciate that, and a happy belated birthday wish to you as well. Michelle Braun, you're next.
Also leveraging on Alan's comment, I'll just make the, I think, fairly obvious point that in the text, the first reference is to the Kriyas Shema, and then on to Rot. And the first prayer most of us learn through the generations is, I don't know, at what, starting at about 3 or 4 years old, is at bedtime to sit, as my father did with me, and his grandfather did with him, to learn to recite the Shema, and that is strictly by rote.
Right.
And then maybe later at some point begin to actually think about the words.
Exactly. I'm sure that I learned the Shema as my first prayer too, though my first memory of Jewish learning prayer was when my grandmother on my dad's side, my mom Sally, Zichrona Livracha, taught me the 4 questions when I was about 4 years old, 4 or 5. And I was an early reader. I know that surprises you in English. And I couldn't tie my shoes till I was 11, but I could read. And she wrote out, I remember this in her kind of a little bit fractured arthritic handwriting on yellow legal pad, a transliteration of the 4 questions so that I could learn them by rote, which is how you're supposed to learn in Judaism, right? You learn by doing, you learn by repeating. And then you've got 4-year-olds who can stand up at a Seder and do Ma Nishtana Halayla. I didn't know what Ma Nishtana Halayla Hazem meant. It's just so deep in me. And then later, the exploration, look, you also need to have a positive emotional, psychological association with Judaism and with Jewish prayer, or you won't want to go deeper. But I agree that it actually starts with the doing and the mastery of the sound. And then comes meaning. And in that way, by the way, it's actually the way human beings best acquire language. They acquire language by repeating sounds, by repeating what they're hearing. They don't necessarily know exactly what they're saying, but the linkage is established very, very early through the doing of it. Okay, onward we go. From Rabbi Shimon, we now proceed to the next of the 5 disciples of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and that is Rabbi Elazar. So he's actually the last. This is Elazar ben Arach, the guy who is the flowing spring as opposed to the sealed cistern, both of which contain water, one of which is stored up without a drop being lost, the other one of which is flowing and does not cease. This is the flower. Okay. Rabbi Elazar Omer. Now you know what that means. Rabbi Elazar says, Heve shakud, a fun word, lilmod Torah. So shakud, I want to just focus on this word for a minute. You should be, and here they say the word diligent. Shakud actually comes from the Hebrew word shaked, and shaked comes from a tree, which is the almond tree. So shkedim are almonds. And a shaked, an almond tree, is the first fruit tree to flower in the springtime. So the idea is, be like an almond tree, lilmod Torah, when it comes to studying Torah. Get up early, study readily, flower forth early in your season, right? So they say the word diligent, but it's such a beautiful, colorful word. Be like a springtime almond tree when it comes to your studying of Torah. Don't delay. So it could mean hasten to study Torah. It could also mean be steadfast, in that predictably spring in Israel is announced by the flowering of the almond tree. And it's considered to be a sign of a new season, it being the first tree. So it's kind of like, what are the first flowers to appear in the springtime? Are they marigolds or the robin? Same idea, right? Be like the springtime robin, flowering early and regularly to announce that it's time to get up and study Torah. Continuing in the text now on the screen, be diligent in the study of Torah. Vidam ma shetashiv le'epikoros. This word here, epikoros, you can see it's written in Hebrew characters, but there is no way, shape, or form that is originally a Hebrew word. It's a Greek loanword. And know how to answer an epikuros. We're going to talk about who an epikuros is. It's a word that comes up a ton in the Mishnah and the Talmud, the epikuros. Vidalifne mi ata amel. Some of you are waiting for the familiar inscription that's over many a holy ark in many a synagogue that says, know before whom you stand. This is not the same. This is know before whom you toil. Amel as opposed to omeid. V'ne'eman hu val melachtecha sheyeshalem lach sechar pe'ulatecha. So, and know before whom you toil, and that your employer is faithful. So we're going to keep with the metaphor. For God will pay you the reward of your labor. Okay. Know how to answer an epikuros. So who are we referring to? What is an epikuros in Hebrew or Greek? Hint. It comes from where you think it comes from. That's the only hint I'll give you. So if the word sounds familiar, tell me what you know about this word as you understand it. Who said that?
I did.
What did
Carol.
you say, Carol?
Epicure.
Right, an epicure, an Epicurean, after the Greek philosopher Epicurus. So what was the basic teaching of Epicurus, the Greek philosopher?
Enjoy your food.
Yeah, basically, Epicurean philosophy is exactly the way we use the word Epicurean today, which is that the meaning of life, the essential purpose of life, said he, is for a man, he would have said a man, for a person to experience all of the pleasure of life. It is not the same as out and out hedonism, by the way. And we can get into the subtle differences if we like, but here's where I have to acknowledge that I am no expert. But what I can tell you is that Epicurean philosophy had made its way into Jewish minds centuries before you have Jewish teachers called rabbis. So Greek philosophy intersects with Jewish literature even during biblical times, which is why you can have a book like Kohelet in the Bible. We sometimes know it as Ecclesiastes, that preaches philosophy that in some places resembles Epicurean philosophy. Everything is vanity, everything is the pursuit of wind. There is nothing new under the heavens. There is a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. Some of these very famous words actually are heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek wisdom traditions, which is why sometimes these parts of the Hebrew Bible, which include large sections of the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs largely, and the book of Job, are generally the three books of the Bible that are most closely associated with the influence of Greek wisdom literature and are sometimes just called the wisdom books of the Bible because they are so indebted to Greek thought. The rabbis, however, want to keep Epicurean philosophy specifically at a kind of arm's length. This idea that the ultimate purpose of life is to experience all of life's pleasures. or in words that may not be directly influenced by Epicurus, but certainly are consistent with his message, that each of us is endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness is definitely consistent with Epicurean thought. And I've often commented that that's not really how Jewish people identify the main purpose of a life well lived. It is not primarily or even secondarily about the pursuit of happiness or the quest for that which gives pleasure. It may well be, if we want to play with the language a little bit, that Judaism is concerned with life, liberty, and the pursuit of holiness. And maybe even in reverse order, that the pursuit of holiness and the pursuit of life are the most important within Judaism. Comments here on Epicureanism and on Judaism, and specifically on what is being instructed by Rabbi Elazar here, that it's not saying to reject an epikuros. It says know how to answer an epikuros. So what does all of this mean? What do you gather about Elazar's frame for understanding the point of living a Jewish life, particularly through this phrase, know how to answer an epikuros? And maybe you might want to find those invisible lines of connection to the second part of his statement, know before whom you toil, know that your employer is faithful, and that God will pay you the reward of your labor. What do all of these ideas have to do with one another, and what do you see in this text? I'm going to open up for a conversation, and I will stop the screen share, so take one more look at it so that you can have the text in mind. Okay. Thoughts, questions? Some of you are unmuted, so I see that Barbara, Audrey, and Joe all have their microphones off. If any of you is prepared to speak or would like to, please do so.
What's curious to me is the Hebrew yishalem lach. Isn't lach feminine?
It is, but it's not. So sometimes for poetic emphasis, something that should be a lecha, which is the customary masculine way of vocalizing you or unto you or yours, is transposed to lach to end on a definitive syllable instead of lecha. It's taken from the Torah. So the short answer, it is not intended to signify anything gendered. Yeah, it's a kind of a fun function of classical Hebrew that sometimes a lecha, a masculine to you or unto you or yours, is transposed to a lach, and similarly otecha, otach, just for poetic emphasis, because it sounds better to end on a strong, open, voweled sound as opposed to lecha.
Oh, or even yishalem, to pay to you is the way I translated it.
Yeah, the correct yishalem lach or yishalem lecha simply means God will pay to you. Mm. Yeah, God will pay you back. Dad's hand, you're up.
If you're putting, for instance, Job and Ecclesiastes into, I guess, a Hellenic sort of rubric, then this passage seems to be very anti-Hellenic.
Indeed.
And I mean,
yes.
Especially the last phrase is completely anti-Jobian. You know.
Yes, absolutely.
This, I guess the message would be more in context with what you get in Deuteronomy, is that there's a, good is rewarded, evil is punished, and then Job and Ecclesiastes comes out to say that's actually not the way things are.
Great. I couldn't have said it better myself. I think you're absolutely right that it's interesting that whoever is responsible for canonizing the books of the Hebrew Bible included a book such as Job, which is such a profound rebuke of the Deuteronomic theology of measure for measure justice, that you do good, you get good, you do bad, you get bad from the hand of God. And that the rabbis seem so intensely uncomfortable at times with this Hellenic outlook, with the Hellenic outlook that rejects measure for measure justice, and often says, well, maybe not so. Maybe the goal of life is actually not to earn brownie points with God so that God will reward you by performance of mitzvot, and God will punish you if you stray, but rather the whole point of life is just get as much pleasure as you can, man, because you're going to die. And that's, again, when I say Hellenic philosophy, it's kind of as broad as saying Jewish philosophy or Jewish theology. There are theologies and philosophies, but broadly conveyed, quite correct, that this seems to be a rebuke of the Greek wisdom or the Hellenic wisdom tradition that seems already to have crept into Jewish thought, and that the rabbis are now rejecting. And one can only conjecture as to the why, right? What would motivate the rabbis? It could well be, as is usually the first go-to place when you want to analyze why the rabbis think and teach the way they do, is that the rabbis are responding to a post-catastrophe reconstituting Judaism set of circumstances, right? So I think the rabbis also are living in a time where they no longer can live insular lives, but rather are in a society that is highly heterogeneous, mixed with lots of Hellenic influence and Roman people and Christians. And they are basically battening the hatches, circling the wagons, and saying, no, normative Jewish thought is that God is going to reward the righteous for their fidelity to Torah, and God will punish the wicked. And even if you can't experience it in your lifetime, remember what we learned earlier in chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot, that there was always an eye watching, an ear listening, and that all of your deeds are recorded in a book. So it may not be the strict in your lifetime measure for measure justice that Deuteronomy promises, but it's closer to that than the Epicurean philosophy of just lap it all up, enjoy the good times, and try and create and cultivate as much pleasure out of life as you can, because then you die. The rabbis, I think, are very much in the business of rejecting Greek wisdom. Final counterpoint to the counterpoint. The final counterpoint to the counterpoint is that in order to know how to answer an epikuros in Judaism, some have suggested that you need to know how to think like an epikuros. So there's an interesting divide in rabbinic thought about how dangerous is what they call in Hebrew chokhmat Yavan. Yavan is Greece, Greece, not Greece the play or Greece the cooking substance. Chokhmat Yavan means the wisdom of the Greeks. There are some rabbis for whom Chokhmat Yavan, the wisdom of the Greeks, we would call it secular learning, because that's what it was at the time in an overarching Hellenic civilization, was a necessity. It's just, like I went to public school. Most of my education, if you break up the time I spent as a youth, was spent on reading, writing, and arithmetic. Some of my education was a few hours of Hebrew school on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. But mostly I was a secular American with some Judaism. Over time, I've come to see myself as less a Jewish American and more an American Jew. In other words, I think over time, my primary identity has shifted to I'm a Jew first and I'm an American second. God forbid I should ever be asked to choose between those identities, but I know which way I'd have to choose if I had to choose. For the rabbis, some of them believe that any exposure to Chokhmat Yavan, to the wisdom of the Greeks, as it were, or to secular learning, is dangerous. Other rabbis say you can't get on in the world without Chokhmat Yavan, that you actually need to be exposed to it, even if it's only to have a thoughtful and informed place by or position by which to reject it. Long digression there, but you've invited me to share it through your insightful comment, Dad, so thank you. Stephen comments here. Greek influence eventually led to the Maccabees. Well, yeah, I mean, it didn't lead to the Maccabees, but it's certainly part of it. I mean, the Maccabees are the ultimate symbol of Jewish resistance to the influence of the Greeks. They are a very problematic band, by the way. The Maccabees were Hicks. They were backwater country priests, a family of Levitical priests, who basically said, we reject all Greek influence, all Greek position, all Greek, Hellenic people or Hellenistic influence in government and in day-to-day affairs. There is no king but God, and we will take up arms to fight for this. They are probably closest in today's world to religious zealots like the Taliban. That's an extremely provocative phrase. I say so knowingly and deliberately. That the level of intolerance that the Maccabees felt toward anything that was not their interpretation of, rock-ribbed, old-fashioned Judaism, priestly Judaism, was not just anathema, but it was worth killing and dying for. Excellent comment, Steve. Okay, let us proceed then. We've learned how to answer an epikuros, and now next. Now from here on out, and actually from here until the entire end of all 5 chapters of Pirkei Avot, we're not really in chronological order anymore. So it seems as if we've drifted away. So we've completed the 5 disciples of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And from here to the end of the entire Pirkei Avot, the entire tractate, we're more going to link up based on theme than on chronology of which rabbi came when in order. It's an interesting observation that may have as much to do with the way in which the book was canonized. I can imagine a bunch of rabbis in the workshop of Rabbi Judah Hanassi, the last of the great rabbis of the early generations of the rabbis, who is credited with compiling the Mishnah. I can see these rabbis with just scraps of parchment attributed to all the old teachers, and some of these probably conveyed through the much vaunted but little understood quote unquote oral tradition. I hate the idea of an oral tradition. I say this often. It's often just a fallback position on something that you can never prove. It's like, yeah, was there an oral tradition? Probably, but all we have are texts. And I tend to believe that texts tend to be indebted to previous texts. Obviously, at some point, something came out of someone's mouth before it was a text. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, here we are with Rabbi Tarfon. So he's later, but now like I said, we're not going to be going in any discernible order of rabbinic pedigree, certainly not any chronological order. Maybe this is connected, however, thematically to what we've just read, right? Because remember what we just read is know before whom you toil, keyword, and that your employer, keyword, is faithful, for God will pay you the reward of your labor, keyword. So the framework is how you expend your hours in toil before God in this world. And so Tarfon's comment is brought next, I think, because it is thematically similar. It uses the same basic metaphor to convey its meaning. Even though Tarfon comes from a different generation, I can't tell you exactly when. You have to look up your little database on when these rabbis lived. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Rabbi Tarfon says, Hayom Katsar, the day is short. Katsar, by the way, fun aside, Hebrew word, it's also the word for to take a scythe or a sickle and cut down grain. So the day is cut down quickly. The day is short. Katsar, also kitzur, means a little of something. If somebody says, do you speak Hebrew? You can say kitzur or bikitzur. I speak a little Hebrew. Hayom katsar. The day is short. The day is katsar. The hamalacha miruba. But the work is big. Miruba, from rav, big. The work is multitudinous. So the day is short, but the work is great. Vehapoalim atzelim. The laborers are lazy. Here they say the laborers are indolent. Most people are just not working hard enough. We'll talk about what the work exactly is. V'hasachar harbeh, but the reward is great. There's that word harbeh. Look in the inside of the word, you see resh bet, which means rav, which means great or big. Same as miruba. So the reward is great. Uval habayit dochek. And literally, the master of the house is knocking on the door. Dochek is a word that means to knock or push or force. Here they say the master of the house is insistent. I love this Mishnah, even though it's a little bit scary. Let's unpack it together. Rabbi Tarfon said the day is short and the work is plentiful. The laborers are indolent, the reward is great, and the master of the house is insistent. What is Rabbi Tarfon talking about? What is his meaning? Somebody writes here, is this the justification for the Haredi to spend all their time studying? It's one of many textual justifications that the Haredi may feel But I do not know because I am not inside that. I am not that fly on the wall of Haredi society. So I do not know what texts they specifically point to reinforce or to prove the correctness of their way of life. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think? The day is short, the work is plentiful, the laborers are indolent, the reward is great, and the master of the house is knocking on the door. The master of the house is insistent.
There are a lot of ways to look at this. The day could be your life. There's a lot to do. People become indifferent and lazy. But if you do your work, the reward is great. And the master of the house, I think, is death.
Very interesting. I like that. It's very interesting because it's not clear. There's a lot of lovely poetic ambiguity in this text that opens up readings that I haven't encountered before. I have not actually heard the master of the house as death. In the context of this phrase, especially if you start with the day is short, I think that's completely solid reading, Diane. I really appreciate it. So thank you for being my teacher. That's really, really nice. Other thoughts here? And by the way, I like your read that a day could mean a life. Indeed, it could. And in many cases, the word day does not specifically mean a 24-hour span of time. So the last line of the 23rd Psalm, probably the most famous quote unquote Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, right? And you know the last line in English is, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But in Hebrew, that's not the last line. Now, of course, ask me what the last line is in Hebrew. I'd have to go back to the beginning of the prayer. Of course, I have the whole thing memorized, but okay. Sorry, bear with me. Le'orech yamim, thank you. V'shavti b'veit Adonai le'orech yamim, and I shall dwell in the house of God le'orech yamim, which literally means for long days. We say forever, but the actual poem, the actual psalm says, V'shavti b'veit Adonai le'orech yamim, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord, literally for a long time. That's not nearly as nice. It's very not King Jamesian. L'orach yamim can also mean all the days of my life. It's not clear. Anyway, my point is that yom, a day, isn't always in biblical and rabbinic Hebrew to be taken literally as a 24-hour stretch of time. Nor is it in English for that matter. You know, you can talk about life by saying the day is long. And if your audience knows that you have a meaning that isn't just about a 24-hour span of time, they'll get it, right? Other thoughts on this text? And what does it say about how these rabbis understand the essence of a Jewish life? I want to bring us back to the main theme of our chapter, of course. And what does this have to do with Epikuros, if anything? Arlene, just unmute yourself kindly.
I think what they're trying to do is say that there's going to be a lot of temptations in life. And I'm not sure that they're saying you can't enjoy life, but they are saying that the most important thing that you can do to devote your energies to is in the study of Torah. And that has to come primary before anything else.
Great. Thank you. Really, really nice. Yeah, this could be a rejection, a further rejection or a reinforcement of the above position that in Judaism, pleasure seeking is actually a pursuit to be viewed with quite some skepticism, if at all. Russell, right. Your comment, please.
This is only half-baked, and I'm sorry, but I would love to share it with everyone nonetheless. There's something about this passage with its emphasis on day and night and the intensity of our labors that is reminding me of the creation story. and of God's creation on each of the days. And at the end of each of the days, it says God saw that it was good. And I wonder, and now, of course, we were cautioned when on the expulsion of the Garden of Eden that we're going to have to work hard. And our labors are not going to be, something, it's going to be very tough. But in the answer to the Epikuros, seems to me, it's not we who see that it's good, it's God who sees that it's not we who take pleasure in it, it's God who will take pleasure in it. I confess I haven't thought this through entirely, but there is something to me it seems to echo the creation in this and our role in it.
Beautiful. Keep baking these ideas. I think it's a very fertile line of thought that you've raised with us today. And I appreciate you having the bravery to share something that even is half-baked, because half-baked for Russell is generally pretty well-baked. So thank you. Judy, your hand is up, as is Michelle's. Well, Judy, specifically, you're unmuted, so I'm going to acknowledge you, but then I'm going to take Michelle's digital hand next. Okay, Michelle, you're on.
Can I ask you to dig into the etymology of a word, a process at which you're very useful, skilled? Sorry, I'm tripping over my tongue here.
No. I take the compliment very lovingly. Thank you.
And the word is what is translated as work.
Yeah.
Is that hamlacha?
Great.
It is not avodah.
Yeah, I think that's significant, Michelle. I think I know where you're going with this. I'm going to bring the text on the screen so that our class can see this important difference. Obviously, they can't see the difference because there's only one word for work here. It's this word here where my mouse is now circling. Hayom katzar, the day is short. V'hamalacha meruba, the work. So malacha generally refers to earthly, not spiritual toil. And it is usually actually used as an analogue or a meaningful contrast to spiritual work. Most notably, almost every time that the Torah enjoins the community to have a Mikra Kodesh, a sacred occasion, such as the festival of Shavuot, which is coming up starting on Sunday night, it will then go on to say Mikra Kodesh, it's a holy occasion, Kol melechet avodah lo tasu, or Kol malacha lo tasu. You must not do any milacha. So it's clear from me that generally in classical Hebrew, milacha refers to earthly toil, your day job. Forget and remember, rabbis also had day jobs. They weren't like I am, who actually has the privilege of, getting paid to be a rabbi. Now, obviously, the contemporary, especially the non-Orthodox, but, even most Orthodox rabbis are doing a lot more than studying Torah all day long, at least in modern Orthodoxy. So I'd like to believe that my spiritual toil and my earthly toil actually are not always the same thing, even though they heavily overlap. But in this case, they're really talking about earthly toil, which would actually provide us with a meaningful way to reject or argue against the idea that this is only about your spiritual toil or your study of Torah. And therefore, for the person who asked, is this a justification for the Haredi way of all you do all day long is study Torah? Then you could say maybe not, because the word milacha generally does not mean spiritual work. It generally means work. Does that help? I think that's a really good question. Is the root melech? Somebody asked me, for king. It is not. There's an aleph in there. There's a rogue letter that changes the root. So it has nothing to do with kingship. It's a false cognate because it sounds like melech, melacha, but you can see this little aleph here. It actually is the same root, though, as an angel of God. A malach has that aleph. So what is a malach? A malach is a messenger. It's one who transmits from God to the earthly sphere. How exactly these all connect, I don't know, but I can look it up in my Brown Driver and Briggs lexicon of biblical Hebrew and get back to you next week. Let us then proceed to the final text for the day. As we talk about reward and punishment and the meaning of life, I mean, we're really into some really deep, deep stuff right now. This is much more than just how you say the Shema in the morning. We're now, as we're getting toward the end of the chapter, really getting into a very serious discussion about what is a life well spent in Judaism and why. And there's this idea that, it isn't all play, and that there is both spiritual toil and toil, and that you just have to have faith that God will reward you for that, because that's what God wants from you. That's what a Jewish life demands of you. Is that consistent with what we as Reformed Jews believe and practice? In many cases, I think it is not. On the other hand, maybe this last text will harmonize some of these themes so that we can end on an achemta, a note of comfort, as is also Jewish custom. So here it is. And you can see the little number 3 down here means that next week, which will be our last session before we go on a hiatus for a little while after Memorial Day and we go into the summer months, it won't be your last chance to do some serious Jewish learning, never fear. But with the high holidays coming extremely early in the secular calendar this year, high holidays start on the Monday of Labor Day. And the fact that we didn't really take a summer break last summer, I think that your hardworking rabbis and cantors are going to take a little bit more time off this summer. We promise we'll have some special learning opportunities. We will come back to this probably even before October. But we're going to be on a summer hiatus after next week. We do have class a week from today before Memorial Day. Okay. And this may be famous to you. So we're still with Rabbi Tarfon, Hu haya omer, he used to say. So in other words, that's why it's in brackets, he meaning Rabbi Tarfon, the same dude who's been teaching us for the last passage. Hu haya omer, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, velo ata ven chorin libatel mimena. This is a song, by the way. Jeff Klepper, the cantor who wrote Shalom Rahava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolaham, which many of us know, also wrote a song called Lo Alecha. Lo Alecha Hamlacha Ligmor, Lo Alecha Ligmor. And then all the camp kids sing, oh baby, Lo Alecha Hamlacha. It's a cute song. It means it is not your duty to finish the work. Literally, it is not on you. Lo Alecha. It is not on you. Hamlacha, there's the word again, ligmor. It is not up to you to finish. Ligmor means to finish the malacha. There's that word again. Vilo, but it is not yours. Vilo ata ven chorin, but you are not at liberty. You are not free. Libatel mimena, to neglect it. Or literally from a word that means to cancel, to spurn. So the work is not yours to complete, neither are you free to neglect it. That's one of the most famous lines in Pirkei Avot. The second part of the text, I'll read the whole thing and then we can come back to it. Im lamadata Torah harbe, if you have learned a lot of Torah, notenim lecha sachar harbe. God will, or literally they will give you, but here they put it in the passive, you will receive much reward. If you learn a lot of Torah, you'll receive a lot of reward. We'll talk about what sachar is, because sometimes sachar literally means remuneration in monetary terms. Here, probably not. V'ne'eman hu val melachtecha sheyishalem lecha sachar pu'ulatecha. Speaking a lot in the same terms that we've heard in the previous text. Faithful is your employer to pay you the reward of your labor. There's the metaphor again, God as employer. Vida matan secharan shel tzadikim le'atid lavo, and know that the grant of reward unto the righteous will happen in the age to come, literally in the forthcoming future, le'atid lavo. Though usually, if not exclusively, le'atid lavo doesn't mean next week or next month or even next year. It means in the next plane of existence. In the next plane of existence, God will be faithful to grant your reward. Okay, my friends, we've covered a lot today, and for the last 10 minutes, we're going to try and make some sense out of this text. Some of it is directly connected to what has come before, and some of it, I think, wraps us up on a very important theme that we should hold with us until next week. So what is this text? What are the key takeaways? How does it land with you and speak inside of you? Here's the chance for you to take a look at the text on the page, but I'm going to stop the screen share just so I can see hands and invite comments. Okay. Joe, did you unmute so that you could share? Audrey, why don't you go next? Because I see your digital hand. Just unmute yourself kindly.
Hear me?
Yeah.
I hear you,
Okay,
Joe.
yeah,
Joe, you'll
I
go
got
first
it,
and then
I got it.
Audrey next. So, okay, we got Joe and then we got Audrey.
Okay.
I agree with you that none of Russell's idea is half-baked. In his manner, I just want to make an observation. I don't know if it's not paraphrasing. What I'm looking for is trying to make an analogy or not hyperbole, with metaphor, trying to use my own metaphor for work as a continuance. I see this as what we're doing now in the vaccination process, in finishing the pandemic. People keep using two expressions. One, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. And two, is that the vaccination is only partially effective, whether it's 85 or 95%. If it's 85, we still have 15% of the work to do to keep ourselves protected. And if the light, one person said, the light of the tunnel is visible, but it's still a long way off. Well, I see that as the daily process with the expression of the Epicurus situation is to continue to work, to look at work as a good thing, as a favorable thing, as a thing we should enjoy doing, so that at the end we get, quote, what may be a reward to us. Some people need a great deal for rewards. Some people need some just little satisfaction of hugging a relative they haven't seen in a while. But those rewards will come if we're diligent in that last 15%, or getting to the end of the tunnel by continuing our work to get there.
Beautiful. Joe, what a beautiful application of text to a modern circumstance that, again, I want to just thank you for being our teacher. That's really a lovely way of applying a salient text to a present consideration. Lovely. Yasher koach. Other thoughts, please. Audrey, you were next in line.
Well, sort of building on the idea of reward, but going in a different direction. I guess I'm a little bit troubled with all the focus on the reward for doing the right thing. Shouldn't that be, theoretically and idealistically, shouldn't that be the reward in and of itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing this is only chapter 2. I can't remember if it's later in Pirkei Avot. Certainly elsewhere in rabbinic literature, though, are many comments that actually take aim at this idea. So we're going to see point counterpoint the deeper we go. I think it is noteworthy that one of the counterpoints is when the rabbis, and I'll have to see which rabbi is attributed to having said this, is the reward for doing a mitzvah is the mitzvah.
Yeah, right.
And that, I think, is an explicit rejection of this mindset.
Right.
Nevertheless, I invite us to consider milieu and context, right? That these rabbis are teaching how to live a Jewish life in the wake of calamity, in the wake of just shattering catastrophe, so that everything that their ancestors had done and known about practicing Judaism is no longer applicable or practicable. On top of that, this is a people who are now carrying an inherited trauma, some of them actually firsthand witnesses to or victims of the trauma of the destruction of the temple and the decimation of the Jewish population and the abuses that were inflicted upon Jewish people, which includes enslavement and rape and, of course, widespread death and destruction. That in the wake of that, a logical question that people of faith, of all different faiths in the region were asking is, what kind of a God would allow this to happen, right? This is so very much like the same kind of gut-wrenching soul searching that was prompted by the Shoah, but without the benefit of post-enlightenment philosophy being widespread at that point. So you're dealing with an ancient world that now, for Jews anyway, has been absolutely shattered. And they're saying, wait a minute, why did all of these good, righteous, pious Jews die in the streets at the hands of the Romans? And the only suitable answer they can come up with, but it's a very important development in Jewish thought, is that God's justice must not be visible here on earth. It has to happen in the Atid Lavo, or in the Olam Haba, in the future time. That yes, it's not that God is unjust, it's just that God has a different timeline. And the whole point of what happens in the hereafter is to rectify the injustices that are visited upon us in this lifetime. So I'm with you, Audrey, that fortunately, I think for those of us who do not accept the idea of measure for measure justice, but who also don't want to be accused of being Epicurean, that we don't think that the only point to life is the pursuit of pleasure, or the only point to Jewish life, there will be other voices that come in that talk about other ways of understanding reward, punishment, obligation, study, toil, and what have you. Lovely comment. Very, very insightful, I think. Okay, Dad, you're on.
Well, maybe in the way of bringing this so it's an ahemta, these are really in consonant with words of encouragement for projects or goals or hope for outcomes that you just can't see because they seem so remote. I think the Chinese said, you know, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Mm-hmm. They talk of what's the best time to plant a tree 30 years ago. When's the next best time today?
Nice.
These are encouraging kinds of feelings about projects, hope for outcomes, resolutions that seem so remote, but still it's saying, you know, keep trying, keep going.
Yasher koach. Beautiful. And especially there's a self-awareness, I think, being expressed by Rabbi Tarfon here, that he is part of a multi-generational project or an eternal project that starts at Sinai and whose end is not yet in sight. But nevertheless, we carry on for the sake of what could be, not necessarily what will be just by me tomorrow. That seems like the perfect lead up to invite us, by way of housekeeping. First of all, heartfelt Yasher Koach and Kol HaKavod to all of us for completing another chapter of Pirkei Avot. We will start chapter 3 next week, even though we'll be on hiatus for the summer. But there's a lot more learning coming up. So let me just invite you to consider the following. Tomorrow night is Shabbat. We have 30 wonderful members of the confirmation, that is 10th grade class of 5781. Who, believe it or not, have participated all year long, both in person and online. So the incredible hybrid class of 5781. Individually, our 30 confirmands will be called up to the outdoor bima of WRT on Friday to be blessed. We're also going to stream our services online as we have been. We'll continue that. I won't even need to say it anymore. It's just going to be the way of the future. Services, even now in person, will also be available online. That's just, we're investing in the infrastructure to be able to do that week in, week out. We have wonderful students. I understand that obviously it's going to be hard to come in a spirit of unadulterated celebration of these wonderful young people, with hearts heavy as they are, anxiously watching the news from Israel. I promise whatever kind of a brief and meaningful update can be provided by me to the congregation on Friday night will be. I do not intend to deliver a long sermon on the subject this Friday night. We're still in a watch, see, pray, and hope mode of expression around the conflict. If you'd like to know more about the background of the conflict, I can certainly share a few thoughts, and I have a few articles, including the one Jerusalem of Glue, which you can now just Google those terms, by Matti Friedman, M-A-T-T-I, Friedman with an I-E. Sunday daytime. We welcome Dr. Andrew Rayfeld. I think the time is 2 or 2:30. And he and I will be engaging in a discussion that he will lead about the future of Judaism, which I'm really excited about. Dr. Rayfeld is the president of the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and a PhD. His academic work was in political science. I'm really excited about his presence, and he will help our congregation at 4 o'clock have a loving online paying tribute to our outgoing temple president, Marcy Harris. And then Sunday night at 7 o'clock, please join us online for a celebration of Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the program for the night of Shavuot, the festival of receiving Torah at Sinai, when WRT will join with 7 other area congregations, and familiar and unfamiliar teachers will offer breakout sessions on a variety of matters of Jewish interest. I am coming this year as a learner, not as a teacher. I hope you will come and learn with our colleagues. It's going to be a lovely night. That's 7 o'clock Sunday. Monday at 7 as well. Our 30 wonderful confirmation students will be leading us, again, viewable online, for our Shavuot confirmation service, with an opportunity for a Yizkor moment of memorial as well. I will deliver remarks to the class of 5781 at that service. That will be available online as well. I have published my remarks finally from the Chai Society Shabbat of a few weeks ago, April 23rd, on the temple website or on my blog, rabbiblake.org. I am not a .com. Rabbi Blake, all one word, .org. You can read that and many other pieces that I've written on the blog. Finally, 2 other things, since I'm in housekeeping mode. Next Friday night, we have a lovely regular Friday night service as usual. So that's a week from this Friday, for the Friday of Memorial Day weekend. And then I hope you'll come on Friday, the 28th, and maybe you'll want to come in person. God willing, the weather will be beautiful. I'm kicking off the most Meshuggah project I've undertaken in quite some time, which is that in honor of Bob Dylan's 80th birthday, which is going to be celebrated on May 24th, starting on May 28th, and every time I preach, at least on a Shabbat or holiday. I'm not promising funerals and bar mitzvahs, my friends, but every time I deliver a sermon on a Shabbat or a holiday for an entire year, I will be referencing the work of the great Bob Dylan. So there will be Torah, and there will be the Torah of Bob Dylan every Shabbat and holiday, including the high holidays, between now and May of 2022. God help me. I'm looking forward to this project. I haven't written a word yet, but I have some thoughts on what I want to do. One of my ideas is you'll also get to hear some of the music of Bob Dylan every time I'm on the Bima between now and next May. So I sure hope you like Bob Dylan. All right, my friends, it is not up to us to complete the work. Neither are we free to desist from it, but it is up to us to complete this class for today. So let me wish you a peaceful Shabbat to come. Let us all pray for peace to come to Israel and the region. And I look forward to seeing you next week as well. Goodbye, my friends.